Okay, so today I'd like to welcome Dr. John Bershaw to our Deep Power podcast. Dr. Bershaw is an associate professor and department chair of geology at Portland State University. He does a variety of research and teaching within earth science, including paleoclimate, stable isotope geochemistry, stratigraphy, and basin analysis. He recently completed a Department of Energy project investigating geothermal potential in the Portland metro area. Dr. Bershaw, welcome to our Deep Power podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Andrew. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I know we've had some time to get to know each other prior to this podcast, but I'd love for you to tell our audience, who you are. How did you get interested in the field of geology? Were you one of those kids just kicking rocks and always playing with rocks? Or, how did that interest ultimately lead you to a professional and academic career within that industry?
Yeah, so I grew up in Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm currently a professor at Portland State University, and it's just sort of fortuitous that I ended up back here. But this is a city that's surrounded by nature, and so I was always exposed to mountains and the coast, and there's a beautiful Columbia River Gorge not far from Portland, so exposed to nature. And so when I went to college, I didn't know what I wanted to study. I went in Los Angeles. I was at Pomona College, and as I was kind of exploring different majors, found out at some point that geology gets you outside and gives you an opportunity to explore nature and such. And so that's really what drew me early on. And then, later on, I did a bunch of traveling, going to different countries, like spent time in the Himalaya and in South America and the Andes. And this is after I had gotten my undergraduate degree. And I had been working in IT, some other sectors. And as I was sort of wandering around backpacking, really, sort of rekindled my interest in geology, looking at these mountains and thinking about sort of walking through the mountains and trying to understand how are these things forming, what's going on, because they're just such massive, amazing features. And so that motivated me to go to grad school and find somebody who is doing research on the creation of high topography, so high plateau and big mountains. And so, yeah, my graduate research was on the Tibetan Plateau, the Pamir Plateau, the Tian Shan Mountains, which are in Central Asia. And then also I did work on the Altiplano and the Andean Plateau in South America, trying to understand how they form ultimately. And then after graduating with my PhD, I had an opportunity to go work for the energy sector. So I went and got a job with Chevron as an exploration geologist and worked in Houston for about 4 or 5 years, which was a wonderful experience for me. I got a lot out of it, met a lot of really amazing people. I felt like it was like going to school all over again. And but I knew that was always kind of interested in experiencing teaching as well. So I always had my kind of eyes out for any opportunities back in academia. And eventually this job in Portland came up and it was a good fit. So
That's awesome.
that's the quick and dirty. And when I got back to Portland, right, I had this now experience in energy. And I was thinking, in the Pacific Northwest, well, how can I apply what I've learned, in Houston to this area? And geothermal really seemed like the right way to focus. So,
Very good. Well, thanks for that background. I had a similar story. I took a geology class my freshman year of college and had no idea that it could be as cool and fun as it was. Like you said, it was the only class I was a part of that allowed me to go outside as part of the class and go up into the mountains of Utah and research and study. So I thought that was great. One of the things that I've kind of seen the common theme is the earth sciences, as we know it today, really aren't taught in the K through 12 curriculum. And so many kids don't get that exposure to earth sciences in, petroleum engineering. I know it's a more advanced study, but what happens is kids don't even know that's a possibility, right? And that's a challenge for people until they go to college to be introduced to that. I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of the earlier education system? Like, how do we as a society introduce these types of topics and curriculum to younger kids so they even know it's an opportunity for them?
yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I didn't have a geology class when I was in high school. I did grow up in Portland, and I have kids who are in middle school right now, and one of them just went to something called outdoor school, which is something that people in Portland public schools do. And I did it when I was a child here. It's been a program that's been going on for a long time, and that's where you head off for a week to a cabin somewhere, either in the Cascades or on the coast, and it's like a nature program.
Hmm.
You learn, it's a lot of biology, but it's also ecology and geology. Geology is included in there. And
Wow.
this is middle school though, and my sense is that, looking at middle school curriculum, there is geology that's sort of inserted in to sort of general science classes. But then once you get to high school, right, it starts getting divided out into chemistry, biology, et cetera, and but not geology generally. I mean, I know there are a couple people, I've come across some people that were fortunate enough to have a geology or an earth science class in high school, but I think it is pretty rare. And yeah, so it kind of gets inserted into other classes. I don't, what, I don't necessarily have a strong opinion that it should be taught in all high schools. I love the idea of it being an option
Yeah.
for people that are interested, and so that people can get introduced to it. But I also understand that you just have kind of limited time,
Yeah.
and so you have to make decisions and prioritize things. And I mean, I have to do the same thing in my own classes. It's like I teach sedimentology and stratigraphy, and there's so much material that I want to cover. I have
Yeah.
a limited amount of time, so I have to prioritize things. And I think high schools are kind of doing the same thing. But what I find for college students coming into Portland State, is that, well, is there a way that I can, we as the geology department, can, collaborate with other departments that are more visible, whether it's biology, whether it's chemistry, and so that students can know that, hey, this also is a path, right? This also is an option, because for some students, geology is the right thing. For other students, it's not. But you at least want students to become aware that this is a possible path, right?
Yeah.
And the
Absolutely.
and the reality is, right now, at least in Portland, and my guess is this is the case elsewhere, is that there are a lot of jobs for geoscientists. Like, there is a lot of supply in terms of jobs, and very little, or not enough students to fill those jobs ultimately. So our graduates who are coming out of the program here are able to, across the board, get employed locally if they want to. And it just makes me, I'm trying to get this word out to students saying, hey, there's a lot of economic opportunity here, whether it's environmental consulting, whether it's geotechnical engineering, et cetera. Um, and I think a lot of students coming into school, that's not necessarily on their radar,
Yeah.
right? That this is an option. So
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I actually think that's amazing that your child has an opportunity to go do that outdoor class. Is that just part of the normal public school curriculum there in Portland?
amazingly, it is. Yeah.
Wow.
This is what I'm
That's
saying. And
neat.
I did it when I was in middle school. It's
Wow.
amazing. It's still happening. And that was
Yeah.
ages ago. So
That's neat. That's great. I mean, not everywhere in the country gives that opportunity, so I think that's great. You had mentioned your interest in geothermal and also that study. I'd love to hear what was that study about? What were you trying to accomplish? What did you find out?
yeah, so this is a study that was funded by the Department of Energy, and it was a highly collaborative project, which is what I think made it really cool. So we had the geology people in the geology department. I was the principal investigator on it, so I was kind of running the show. But there were some other folks in the geology department at Portland State who were involved. But there was a whole host of organizations, from the United States Geological Survey, the city of Portland was involved, Oregon Health Sciences University was involved, which is a research and teaching hospital here in the city of Portland. Alta Rock Energy, which is a geothermal exploration company based out of Seattle, they were involved. So it was a very kind of faceted group of folks that have different expertise. We had some economists from Portland State also, so people outside of the geology department who were involved. And the whole point, the reason why we had to put this really multidisciplinary team together, is because of the question that we were asking, which the research question was, and this is very applied, very practical, was we wanted to identify a potential end user, so somebody who's going to use this energy, right? And that end user was Oregon Health Sciences University. So
Mm.
it's this teaching hospital. It's critical infrastructure, right? It's the biggest hospital in the area, and we're in an area that has geohazards. There's potential for earthquakes, floods, all sorts of different things can happen. We have, we're in a volcanic terrain, so we can have volcanic eruptions. We have Mount St. Helens, one of the most, famous volcanic eruptions in recent times, happened in Portland's very close to that. So we have all these sort of hazards around, and so we focused on critical infrastructure, a hospital, and wanted to say how can we diversify their energy supply so that a place like this, or you could apply it to an airport even, or so a place like this is still able to function even if some of the main kind of energy systems start to go down in an event. And this is what we call resiliency, right? So increasing resiliency. And one of the ways to do that is to diversify the energy supply through something like geothermal. Okay. And so that's sort of the motivation. So we identified the end user, which is Oregon Health Sciences, and the sort of form of geothermal that we're talking about here is really novel. It's really different. It's not conventional geothermal in the sense that like Iceland, right, which is a great, beautiful example of geothermal being used. They sit on a volcano, right, and they have all this hot rock underneath them, not far underground, that they're exploiting for their heating and also generating electricity with it. In Portland, what we were talking about, we do have a volcanic chain, and we have conventional geothermal where people go to the volcanoes and find really hot rock not far from the surface, and are looking into being able to use that to generate electricity or otherwise. What we decided to do was say, okay, well, the city of Portland isn't sitting on top of a volcano, right? It's sitting in a valley. And this is the case with cities all over the country. Cities are generally in basins, right? They're on where it's flat. That's where you build. That's where you have groundwater. There's a lot of resources that exist there as well. And so how can we potentially use geothermal here? So what we decided to test was this idea of thermal energy storage. Okay. And what that means is that we're going to use geothermal in a direct use application. And what that means is we're going to use that heat under the ground to directly heat buildings. Okay. So we're not generating electricity with it, right? That wouldn't be a direct use application where you have hot water and it's hot enough that you can actually run generators and such to create electricity. In this case, we're doing direct use. So we're just taking that heat and we're directly heating buildings through heat exchangers. So this is a direct use application, and the reason for that is because it's going to be a lower temperature geothermal. Okay, you're not going to have the same temperatures you're going to get on top of a volcano. And the reason to focus in the Portland area is, well, we have the city, but we also have underneath our feet, we have basin sediments that are that are a good candidate really for circulating fluids, right? And that's a key aspect to being able to harness that heat underground and bring it to the surface. You got to be able to, okay, the heat can exist underground, but you got to get it to the surface. How do you do that? You send fluids down there, some probably water or some mix of water. It could be brackish water, or whatever, but you have something that's circulating down there and heating up that fluid. And then you bring that hot fluid back to the surface and you can use it, right? Well, in the basin, we understand the stratigraphy. We understand what those sediment layers look like. And those sediment layers are good reservoir rock. They're permeable, they're porous. So fluid moves through them well. Okay, so that is not a risk in the basin. The issue that people have going to the mountains, going to the volcanoes, is circulating the fluid. You're circulating fluid through a volcanic rock, which it's not as porous, not as permeable, at least in a predictable way. So people run into problems there. You got the heat, but you don't have the ability to get that heat to the surface by circulating. In the basin, we can circulate, no problem. We don't have the heat, right? It's not nearly as hot under our feet. And so we decided to kind of flip it on its head and say, okay, we can circulate fluids. We don't have heat. We're going to go ahead and create the heat. So how do we do that? Well, during the summer, let's say that we want to heat our building. So this was kind of the concept. We have the hospital. The hospital has heating needs in the winter, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take water during the summer that's being heated through direct use solar. So we could have solar panels that are heating water. We could use waste heat from air conditioning units. Okay, we're heating this water during the summer, and then we take that hot water and we inject it into the subsurface. So we're storing it. This is the thermal energy storage piece, right? We're using geothermal really as a thermal battery. Okay, so we take that hot water from the summer, we inject it in the subsurface during the summer, and then in the winter, so we have the seasonal use, right? In the winter, we start producing that same water that we injected during the summer. That same water, it stays hot, right? We create this sort of thermal mass in the subsurface, so it stays hot down there. This is the battery, and then we produce it, bring it back to the surface when we need it, when we have those heating needs in the winter. And you can flip it on its head. You could do the same thing with cooling. And one of the findings that we came out of this study was that even though we were focused on heating, because that just seemed intuitive to us at the time, actually the cooling demand and the cooling resource through thermal energy storage is much greater. So that seems to be actually a more even viable pathway, economically and otherwise, would be to flip it on its head and say, okay, we're actually going to cool the water in the winter. And you can do that. We have a river that runs through, right? The Willamette River comes right through town. OHSU, this hospital is right on the river. We could cool water in the winter, inject that in the subsurface, and then produce that, bring that to the surface in the summer when we need to cool the building. It actually has more cooling needs in the summer than it has heating needs in the winter. So that's the basic concept. And I would say the findings from the study were that yes, you can do this. And like I said, we had this multidisciplinary team to understand what are the economics of it, right? Is this something that could compete with other types of energy, conventional sources of energy? In this case, we were looking at heating, so natural gas and otherwise. And we found that yes, it can compete. It's at least in the ballpark. It's not the cheapest option, but it's not out of control, right? It's not like 2 times as much as anything else. And I think that you could very easily make the argument that, hey, there are some other benefits here, whether it's regarding, the fossil fuel emissions, or whether you're talking about resiliency, which I mentioned before, that really make that small amount of extra cost worth it.
I think that's very interesting. And my experience, I haven't been in the industry as long as you necessarily, but most people's perspective of geothermal is exactly what you're talking about: heating or cooling of some form, right? City of Boise's been doing it for decades. Like you mentioned, about 90% of the island of Iceland's heated that way or cooled that way. You're talking about a fairly more sophisticated way, like you said, of the storage. And that is an interesting field that people are going into as they're trying to, we can't get enough lithium to store energy for batteries, right? So
Yeah.
people are looking at hydrogen, but another very available resource is your geothermal battery storage, if you will, whether it's brine water. But I mean, I'm just learning how conducive, that brine water can be. So there's a lot of advancement and there needs to be a lot more research, but I think that is an awesome opportunity. And to your point, is it the cheapest? Maybe not. Is it sustainable? Absolutely. Is it clean? Yeah, there's obviously some environmental impact, in some form, but I think thanks for sharing that study. Is that a published paper that we could link to this video so people could look at it if they want?
Yeah, the work on this came out in a lot of different ways. There's a couple different publications that I could refer people to. There's one that's sort of a shorter executive summary that was presented in the Stanford geothermal workshop that I think is probably the best one for people that just want to get a flavor of
Great.
what it is. There's also a Department of Energy report that's hundreds of pages long, so for people that wanted to really dive into the details. But yeah, there's sort of an executive summary out there that we could link, that's from the Stanford geothermal
Great.
workshop, that's probably 5 pages with
Awesome.
some interesting figures that kind of give people a sense of what it is exactly that we're talking about, some schematics with well pairs and things.
Yeah. Well, and I know that's
tables.
great. We would
Yep.
love to share that. And I think while the holy grail that many people are searching for, even including deep power, is to really reach super hot rock, 400 degrees Celsius or higher, which has the potential to produce, 20, 30, 40, 50 megawatts, depending
Right.
on the area, right? That is the holy grail. There's a very large market of need for the HVAC, heating and cooling industry, right? I mean, a large portion of our country's power production goes just to heating and cooling of homes, right?
Yes.
So we can't put it past, even though it's more exciting to say you could power turbine and power the city of Manhattan someday. Most of that power is going to heating and cooling. So I think that research is very important to our power consumption needs. Geothermal as a whole, let's talk about power capacity of, the megawatts that we were talking about.
Uh-huh.
Do you see geothermal being a viable candidate? I mean, solar became so widely adopted because there was massive government push, right? Massive subsidies, tax breaks,
Right.
and so people adopted it. They paid, they financed to get solar panels on their house. It may or
Right.
may not economically be viable. It might take 20, 30 years to amortize whatever cost it took, but there was huge incentives, and that's from the
Mm.
government, and that's why I think it got adopted. In order for large scale geothermal to really be produced or become a competitive energy source, do you feel that it would require something similar from a government private partnership in terms of like pushing out grants, subsidies, or something like that?
I think that that would help for sure. I don't know if it's required or not. I mean, it's a really good question. One of the things that I find myself thinking about a lot is what are the barriers to adoption, right? Why do we not have widespread use of even just take ground source heat pumps, which are, we understand how those work. There's not like a it's that's not like a really area of intense research because that's a well, and there are people that research it on from the engineering side for sure, but ground source heat pumps, what for people that aren't familiar is, a lot of homes, just you can get this in your house, then this is pretty common now. Like people do this, it's pretty conventional, where you ultimately get a system that pumps water through the relatively shallow subsurface from a geologic perspective, at least, where you have kind of a constant temperature through the year, right? The temperature in the subsurface, if you go down a little ways, it doesn't change like you get seasonal air temperatures, right? And so in the summer, it's cooler than the ambient air. And then in the winter, it's warmer than the ambient air. And so you use that to your advantage to heat and cool your home. And that's something that a lot of people do at this point. In the US, I don't know what the adoption rates are or anything, but I know that it's pretty common and you can get it done in a home. And it's even more common in certain other countries. I think that if there were subsidies, that would definitely help to encourage people to do that. And I would definitely support that just because of the benefits in terms of reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, et cetera. But when it comes to something like thermal energy storage, or even a lot of the stuff that's happening in what I'll say the high temperature geothermal realm, like what you're talking about, whether it's these deeper wells, or whether it's what's Alta Rock Energy, they're at the moment they're exploring on Newberry, which is a active volcano in the Cascades, and they're trying to figure out how to circulate fluids there, and they're talking about using enhanced geothermal,
Yep.
which is ultimately creating the permeability, right? Because again, they've been having trouble with the circulation stuff, and so there's a lot of research that's going on in those areas, and so there's which ultimately means that it's just a riskier domain,
Yeah.
right? The
And more
thermal energy
expensive.
storage stuff that I'm talking about is a riskier domain because it's not as well established.
Yeah.
Right, we don't have a lot of examples of it, and in the U.S., very few. There's actually some other countries that have done thermal energy storage successfully, in Europe and also in China. It's more widely adopted. So there are examples of people doing it, but I think that when a technology is new, right, there's going to be there's just inherently more risk associated with it because you don't have successful examples, a lot of successful examples, and so you got to sort of calculate that into the cost
Yeah.
ultimately, right? And so yes, subsidies would be helpful in that respect. I think the thermal energy storage piece is still kind of in the research phase where it does need public money. And when I say public money, I mean like Department of Energy, National Science Foundation support to get some real life projects off the ground where you see it being demonstrated, and so we can actually test some of those risks that remain, because there are definitely risks still out there, which I didn't really talk about, but yeah, we need to actually do it. And a lot of times public money is required because if you're just doing it from a purely economic perspective, um, companies aren't going to do it when you have the level of risk that still exists there. You just don't have enough of a guarantee that you're going to have a payout. And having my experience at Chevron, I know that they brand themselves as an energy company. Yeah, they do oil and gas primarily, but they are an energy company, and they do that because they will go into any form of energy that they see as being economically viable.
Right.
But that's the key. It's got to be there, and they're going to do it if it is economically viable. If it's not, they won't. And so for emerging technology where you have a lot of risk, you need that sort of research arm
Yep.
support to help establish. So yeah, subsidies in terms of emerging technology, right, on the research front. But then also, I would support subsidies on the front of like ground source heat pumps, like I mentioned, just to get them rolled out more and popularize them. I think that would be good public policy, personally.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of need, and a lot of it's also public perception and understanding. I think lobbyists are, you know, for certain industries have been stronger, more prolific in terms of Capitol Hill. And I know as our lawmakers become more educated on the potential, there could be more opportunity. There's one study that shows that by 2050, people think, or the study shows that geothermal might only play about 2% of the total energy production, which is not large enough. But one thing, I was at the University of Oklahoma a couple of days ago talking to some petroleum engineers there, and they made an analogy that fracking's really only been around and adopted for the past decade. And people had done it before, but it really wasn't until the last 10 years that it became more sophisticated, advanced, and more useful.
Mm-hmm.
And they use that analogy to say, even though that study shows 2050 might only be 2%, a lot of advancement technologically can happen in the next 10 years that will give us a faster trajectory to explore, research, and hopefully see if this is a viable energy source. But one of the things I like about the ability to stand on the backs of your Chevron experience and the oil and gas industry is geothermal is 60% oil and gas work, right? You're going to drill your first several miles using traditional oil and gas methodology, and then beyond that, it's kind of new technology. But one of the things in terms of energy storage that I thought was neat was being able to take, let's say, an existing abandoned well that an oil
Uh-huh.
company's used. They pulled out all the oil they can. There's fractures, but being able to then recycle that well and that oil bed as the energy storage, right? There's a lot of space in
Mm.
that rock that they pulled out that you could put hot water in and store it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of opportunity across the country to say, let's clean up the negative perception of oil and gas, but now we have maybe the opportunity to recycle and use and become sustainable and say, hey, now let's use this for a better, more cleaner, way of storing. So I think it'll be fun to see what happens in the next decade in terms of that. But
No,
any other,
I
yeah,
agree. Just real quick. I mean, I love that conversation, like that idea of using, legacy wells. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Mistfield. It's I am, mainly because it's just outside my door here. There's a natural gas storage and recovery facility in the Northern Coast Range, just outside Portland, sort of Northwest Oregon, and it's run by Northwest Natural Gas. And that field used to be a natural gas field, right, where there were exploration companies that went up there, found natural gas. They were producing it just as a conventional field, and eventually they kind of took care of all the low hanging fruit, but in the process of producing it, they learned about the subsurface, right? They understood what those containers look like, the size of the containers. And when I say containers, I mean reservoirs, right? That store the natural gas, and you can store whatever you want in them. But the subsurface rock that acts as a container for natural gas or fluids or whatever. They learned about that storage container really well over those years of production, and eventually decided to utilize that knowledge as natural gas storage and recovery. So now they have pipelines that come through a network that runs into Canada, et cetera. And in winter, when demand in Portland is high, it often exceeds the amount that can come through the pipeline. And so
wow,
during summer, when demand is low, they actually still pump a lot of gas through the pipeline, and then they store it in that natural gas field, in that legacy field. Really, they inject it in the subsurface there into these reservoir rocks that they understand really well, and then in the wintertime they use that to supplement what comes through the pipelines. And it makes sense, right?
mm-hmm.
It's a good usage of a legacy field. And
Right.
I actually just got an email from I'm involved in a couple different geothermal proposals right now. There's just so much interest, I'm realizing, in geothermal from even the funding agencies, National Science Foundation, et cetera. right now. It's really on their radar at the moment. And one of the partners in one of these proposals sent me a link to, just speaking to what you had mentioned, to a small operation in Bakersfield, California, right, which is where you have a conventional oil and gas field down there that's been going for over 100 years, in Southern California there. And there are, old wells there, some of which aren't being used anymore. And their idea was to use an old well. And my understanding is that they have like a weight that they ultimately put into the well. And when they have like high energy supply, whether it's from solar or whatever, they use that energy to lift the weight up.
Hmm.
And then during nighttime, in the solar world at least, where you don't have the sun shining, that weight, the potential energy from that weight, you can use that to generate energy. So it's sort of like storing, but
Wow.
it's interesting usage of an old oil well. I was just like, people are
Absolutely.
coming up with all sorts of wild
Yes.
ideas.
And it's way cheaper. The well's been dug. The fractures may have, hydrologic fractures have occurred. And if you could utilize that, I mean, that's a fairly cheap way to store that amount of energy. So I totally agree. I'd love to stay in touch with you if you become a part of any of those kind of studies. But I'm grateful for your research. I know in the field of academics, we can't really make those advances in terms of technology sometimes without even, again, I use that word, public private kind of partnership.
Yeah.
We have our sponsor research agreement with the University of Oklahoma. We're working on some other sponsor research agreements with other universities, but your infrastructure, your team, your background becomes a very important piece in helping kind of the commercial industry advance technology. So thanks for that research. I want my audience to be aware of what you guys are doing at Portland State. Your background will make some of your resources available. And I'll stay in touch as I continue to watch what great things you're doing over there at Portland State.
Hey, appreciate it, Andrew. And yeah, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate getting to share some of what we've been up to. Yeah.
You bet. Thank you for your time. Have a great one.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks.